Good evening, everybody. Bonsoir tout le monde, et bienvenue au débat international de Glendon. I'm going to begin this evening with a land acknowledgement to acknowledge the First Peoples on whose traditional territory we live and work. Glendon, en tant que partie intégrante de l'Université York, reconnaît sa présence sur le territoire traditionnel de nombreuses nations autochtones. La région connue comme Takaronto a été préservée par la nation Anishinaabeg, la Confédération Haudenosaunee et les Hurons-Wendat. Elle est désormais le foyer d'un grand nombre de communautés autochtones, inuites et métises. Nous reconnaissons les titulaires actuels du traité, la Première Nation des Mississauga de Credit. Ce territoire est soumis au traité de la ceinture wampum, Dish with One Spoon, entente définissant le partage et la préservation pacifique de la région des Grands Lacs. My name is Joanna Robinson, and I am the Interim Director of the Glendon School of Public and International Affairs, and I'm delighted to welcome you here this evening for a discussion on a timely and critically important topic, housing affordability in Toronto. At this time, I would like to thank our sponsors and our partners for this evening's event, and that includes the City Institute at York University, the Robarts Centre for Canadian Studies at York, and the Canadian International Council. The event is organized by the Glendon School of Public and International Affairs, and I would like to thank the amazing staff of the school, Sarah Del Piano, and in particular to Megan Kay for her work getting this virtual event set up. This event is the 13th of the Glendon Global Debates, whose purpose is to foster engagement and lively discussion on critical issues of our time. And housing affordability are most certainly at the forefront of public policy. And in many ways, this issue is even more relevant today in light of the many housing challenges we've seen with the COVID-19 pandemic. Tonight, we welcome an amazing panel of experts and a wonderful moderator who will all be introduced to you shortly. I wish you all a wonderful evening. And I also want to encourage you to please check out our website of the GSPIA to find out more about the school and our flagship program, the Masters of Public and International Affairs. So now it gives me great pleasure to introduce and welcome William Jenkins, the director of the City Institute at York, who will tell you a little bit about the Institute, and then welcome our moderator for this evening, Jane Farrow. Over to you, William.
Thanks very much, Joanna. It's a pleasure to introduce Jane. Jane Farrow is a public consultation specialist working in the areas of city building, transportation planning, culture strategy, and economic development policy. She worked for 10 years as a CBC radio producer for shows like This Morning and The Sunday Edition. She also hosted shows like Workology and Wanted Words. She's the co-editor of the 2 editions of the Book of Lists, published in 2005 and 2017. She has also published Any Other Way, a queer history of Toronto, published in 2017, that was shortlisted for the Toronto Book Award. Jane was also the founding executive director of Jane's Walk, a global initiative involving free, locally led walking tours inspired by urbanist Jane Jacobs' ideas about connected, livable neighborhoods. In 2010, the Toronto Community Foundation recognized Jane's contribution to community development with the Vital People Award. So thank you, Jane, for being part of this event.
Thank you very much, William. Start my video. There we go. It's hard not to whinge through your own bios being read. And it's like, oh, I've got to edit that. Oh, that's so long. But you know what? It's an honor to be here. Listening just for a little bit of the conversation with the panelists. Like, my gosh, there's some very thoughtful people who know a lot about some pretty important stuff happening in our cities these days. So I'm really keen to get to them. I've moderated a few of the panels here at Glendon. They've always been really exciting and a good exchange of ideas and super interesting. So it's great to be back after a long break, obviously COVID related. So I think that we're just going to get rolling here. How are we seeing the panelists up now? I'd like to, obviously their names are Keisha St. Louis McBurnie, Scott Leon, and Nemoy Lewis. They're on screen there now, I think. There you are. Hello. Let's do the Brady Bunch thing, like wave. Okay. All right. I think the idea here is we're just going to start now. I think that Keisha, you're going first. Is that the arrangement? Okay, good. All right. So I'm just going to introduce Keisha a little bit here. She's an emerging urban planner, and she's just completing her Master's of Science in Planning at the University of Toronto, where she researches alternative practices for inclusive city building at the intersections of housing, community, economic development, and land use planning. And that is an active intersection, isn't it? So Keisha, unmute yourself, and got about 5 minutes for some basic remarks and an overview. Thanks.
Sorry, to clarify, I thought it was 10 minutes.
Oh, 10, I'm so sorry. You're right.
Awesome.
That's very important. All right.
I'm just going to share my screen now. Can you see this?
Yep.
Wonderful. So thank you so much for the introduction, Jane, and thank you to the team at York for organizing tonight's event. As Jane just said, my name is Keisha St. Louis-McBurnie, and I'm currently a graduate student in the Department of Geography and Planning at the University of Toronto. Tonight, I'm going to talk a bit about what it means to live cooperatively. So just taking a step back real quick, one of the first things that comes to mind for me with respect to realizing the right to housing are two grave human rights violations in the city of Toronto. On the left, we have a photo of tent encampments in downtown Toronto, and on the right, there's a photo of the electrical fire that took place at 650 Parliament Street, which is a private rental building in St. Jamestown that displaced residents from their homes for over a year. Some of those folks still have not been able to return home. The reason that I bring this up is because I live not too far away from 650 Parliament Street. A lot of my own research is related to my lived experiences. I grew up in cooperative housing in Cabbagetown, and a lot of the people that I went to school with and grew up with live in St. Jamestown and in 650 specifically. And so this is a deeply personal issue for me. In preparation for tonight's conversation, I was compelled to return to a report that was written by Emily Parody for Right to Housing Toronto, where among other questions, she asked the following. So one, how do we prevent financialization, mass evictions, and other consequences of the economic impacts of COVID-19? And two, can measures implemented in response to the crisis become the foundation for new housing policies and programs that deliver affordable, accessible, and quality homes? So when reflecting upon recent crisis response measures, there was something that was notable to me, and I'm sure many others, and that's the fact that recent federal, provincial, and municipal responses to COVID still have not included substantial reinvestment in the social housing sector. And so today I'm going to argue very briefly that we need to wrestle with our own individual goals and understandings of what individual homeownership means and shift towards a vision that values community wealth building and collective ownership and a rights-based housing system to achieve real housing justice. And there are many, many methods for doing this, but I'm going to focus primarily on the role that cooperative housing plays in the movement to realizing the right to housing. And just a little more context about me and where this aligns with my own research. I am a student in the planning program at U of T, and I'm currently working on a major research project that will be completed in spring 2021. The project will explore what cooperative housing solutions are being organized and developed to provide new affordable housing across Canada in the last 10 years, while also looking to develop a stronger understanding of how the sector has continued to create new supply in the absence of meaningful federal funding from government. Moreover, this research is seeking to illuminate the types of innovative partnerships and structures that are being created between cooperative housing federations, community groups, governments, developers, and financial institutions to develop cooperative communities at various scales. So in tonight's presentation, I'm going to speak very briefly about what cooperative housing is, what cooperative values are, what new supply looks like in Toronto in comparison to Vancouver, and what some local opportunities are for expanding the sector. So housing cooperatives come in many different typologies. It can be a large apartment style building with hundreds of units, or a series of smaller semi-detached houses or homes in a given neighborhood. Along the housing continuum, non-equity housing cooperatives, which is what I'm focusing on this evening, are considered both social housing and provide market rental housing because they contain both market units and subsidized units for low and moderate income households. So in this circumstance, market units are where members are paying full market price for a unit, and subsidized units are where members are only paying a portion of the full market price, and the remainder is being covered through a subsidy agreement. So essentially, those residents are only paying 30% of their income on their housing unit. These subsidies are increasingly more difficult to come by because of growing housing wait lists, as well as some challenges being experienced with the expiration of operating agreements for cooperatives. Just to note that tonight I will not be talking about other models of cooperative housing, which include limited equity co-ops, and multi-stakeholder models. But these are typologies that are prominent in other parts of Canada, like Alberta, for instance. All right, so these are two prominent examples of what cooperative housing look like in the city of Toronto. So on the left, we have Woodsworth Housing Cooperative, which is located in the St. Lawrence neighborhood. And on the right, we have Bain Apartment Cooperatives, which is clearly inspired by more classical planning theory related to the Garden City. There's a common green space in the center of a courtyard surrounded by housing units that are townhouses. And clearly these residents have a very intimate connection with each other and relationship in the common space. I'm briefly just going to define what some of the benefits are of cooperative housing. So as I just mentioned, co-ops are often mixed income communities by their nature. Residents are members and they're not tenants. So there are no landlords in this scenario. Members themselves run the co-ops. And so there are no excessive rent increases and housing remains secure for members because of the nature of bylaws and operating agreements. Of course, co-ops are deeply rooted internally in community, and in the city of Toronto, they're connected to a wider network of housing cooperatives and other enterprises in the city, such as credit unions that are also functioning on similar principles. And so on that note, I'm quickly gonna just outline some of the really common cooperative principles are. So some among others include, co-ops are voluntary and they're required to have open membership. In this scenario, members exercise democratic control over their lives and quite literally their homes, and they practice economic democracy in this fashion. Also, co-ops and their members exercise autonomy and independence, and co-ops are also really into engaging members in education and training. So we know that in the early 1990s, the federal and provincial governments disinvested in the social housing sector. This killed a ton of cooperative housing projects that were in the works towards the end of the century. So this table is displaying what the most common types of incorporated co-ops are in the province and in the city of Toronto pre-1970 up until 2019. So as we can see here, during the existence of the previous federal housing program, co-ops were the most common type of incorporated co-op in Ontario and in Toronto up until 1994. So with the discontinuation of the program and the devolution of responsibilities to municipalities, housing co-ops are no longer the most common incorporated type of co-op in the city and in Ontario. So more specifically, only 17 housing co-ops have been registered in Toronto since 1995 and only one in 2015. This is according to provincial data. So at this time, it's important to pause and to contextualize this shift in housing policy within the crises that we're currently experiencing with respect to housing and COVID and anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism. So with the cutting of social supports, a new state emphasis on subsidizing individual home ownership and the financialization of housing, Toronto is clearly seeing growing socioeconomic and ethno-racial inequality, and people are being priced out of and more violently displaced from their homes. So here are a couple more recent examples of what housing cooperatives look like in the city of Toronto. So on the left, we have 60 Richmond Housing Cooperative, and on the left, we have Naismith Housing Cooperative. So 60 Richmond is the result of a partnership between Toronto Community Housing, the Cooperative Housing Federation of Toronto, and Unite Here, which is the union representing hospitality workers. This partnership came per request to TCH from the city of Toronto to provide this housing on city surplus land. And so on this site, it's interesting that TCH has a 50-year ground lease from the city, and TCH subsequently leases the building to the co-op, which contains 85 residential units. On the right, we have CHFT's Naismith Nonprofit Housing Cooperative, whose units are contained within a new built condominium. These units are held in a nonprofit land trust at 10 York Street. This example is particularly curious because the co-op only contains 12 housing units that are scattered throughout the 9th and 13th floor of this condominium building that has a total of 725 units. And this partnership was made possible through the sale of public land, a Section 37 built form contribution, and a series of waived charges and property taxes for a period of 50 years. I think that this example challenges us to think critically about more theoretical questions, specifically about the tensions between the existence and establishment of housing cooperatives within neoliberal financialized housing forms and the extent to which they actually perpetuate existing inequities in our housing system, and more practically about the extent to which this kind of inclusionary model, which could closely resemble inclusionary zoning, and whether or not it's actually effective at fostering cooperative principles and concern for community. So very quickly, in sharp contrast, I'm going to speak about a bit about Vancouver, and specifically Vancouver's Community Land Trust, which is a nonprofit organization, which was created by the Cooperative Housing Federation of BC, which announced in 2018 that it had entered into a partnership with the city of Vancouver to build 1,000 units of new affordable housing across 7 public sites. So although very different, this program most closely resembles the City of Toronto's market-oriented Housing Now program. And this specific precedent is lauded as the single largest one-time municipal land investment in the community housing sector. And so very quickly, the reason why I'm highlighting this program is because it's an important precedent for many reasons, including the fact that it gives a really strong example of how the sector can partner with the public sector to overcome, its most significant barrier, which is obtaining land in very expensive real estate markets. And notably, this partnership is also allowing cooperatives and nonprofit housing societies to create new sustainable projects. So many of the projects that are being created out of this program are being built at passive house standards, while also providing dignified housing for Vancouver's most vulnerable, including residents who live in the downtown east side, Vancouver's urban Indigenous population, other low-income households, and families living with HIV and AIDS. And so to conclude, there remain a few important opportunities for us to expand the sector here in Toronto, particularly to provide housing for low and moderate income households. So in this vein, yes, we should continue to advocate for a more ambitious Housing Now program, and we should continue to build upon the progress that's being made with the City of Toronto's Housing TO 2020-2030 action plan. But there are also larger development opportunities in our backyard that we should be paying attention to, which includes the redevelopment of Downsview Park, which is incredibly close to the Jane and Finch community, as well as the revitalization of the Portlands, both of which are major public land sites. Again, to bring this back around, as a young person who was born and raised in cooperative housing in Toronto, who does not always see myself being able to afford property on my own in the city, I think that it's critically important that we invest in models that value community wealth building, collective ownership, and continue to advocate for the implementation of a rights-based housing system.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you very much, Keisha. Now, there's a couple of quick questions in the chat that we could either take up in the Q&A, or you can go into the chat and answer them directly if you want, Keisha. Some of them are, I think, pretty simple, pretty straight up. But keep those questions coming, people. We'll get to them with the Q&A. And next up is Scott Leon. Scott Leon, he's a researcher at the Wellesley Institute, which is a research and policy nonprofit in Toronto. Scott studies problems related to housing affordability and creative policy solutions to housing challenges. Scott, you got 10 minutes too.
Great, thank you, Jane, and thank you, Keisha, for that really interesting presentation. Hello, everyone. My name is Scott Leon. I'm a researcher at the Wellesley Institute. The Wellesley Institute is a research and policy nonprofit. And our mandate is to improve health and health equity through policy action on the social determinants of health. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about some research that I've been doing on residential evictions in the city of Toronto. And I thought I would start off with a short story about how I first got interested in residential evictions. And so for the past 5 years, I've been working with a number of youth shelters, as well as CAMH, to help support youth transition out of homelessness. And after the intense energy and effort that I would see youth put in, as well as social workers and our social service sector. I spoke with 90 youth for 300 hours, and again, I would see evictions disrupt this transition and it lead to youth cycling back into homelessness. I would run into them again in the shelter after they've already been moved out. Often with less hope and less resilience, after this eviction. And it was often for a small amount of arrears or what seemed to me a preventable conflict with the landlord that an eviction could have been prevented. So it got me asking, what are some basic facts around evictions in the city of Toronto? How many are there? Where are they? Who's most at risk? And looking through the literature, there hadn't been any significant research on evictions in the city of Toronto for around 15 years. And as we know, a lot has changed, especially now with the pandemic and the pandemic recession, as well as before that, the great financial crisis. So let me put up my presentation here. Can everyone see this? Yeah? Okay, great. Yeah, so my Twitter handle is Scott Leon TO. If you want to tweet at me, if people are interested in that, or if they want to email me, my email is scott@wellesleyinstitute.com. Should really put that on there. And so I began this work in 2018, but as the process is often slow to get researched out, this paper finally was released in August 2020 in the height of the pandemic. And along with my colleague, James Ivanuk, we wrote a report looking at formal eviction applications in the city of Toronto. And you can find this on the city or on the Wellesley Institute website or on my Twitter. It's called Forced Out: Evictions, Race, and Poverty in Toronto. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this research and then our next steps. So as I described, this paper really is looking at what are the numbers and rates of formal eviction applications over our study period, which was 2010 to 2018. Where, so what is the geographic distribution of eviction applications in the city of Toronto, and who? So who are living in census tracts with higher eviction filing rates? And so the data that we used for this, the main data source was administrative data from the Landlord and Tenant Board. This is basically the Landlord and Tenant Board's docket for formal eviction applications. And since the Landlord and Tenant Board doesn't collect any information on sociodemographics, what we did is we linked eviction filing rates to 2016 census data for different census tracts. So I want to note that these are only formal eviction applications. And we know from connections with the community that many evictions take place informally, illegally, and without documentation. And this research cannot really speak to those, unfortunately, but we'll be looking at those in next steps of our research. One of the big things that stood out to me first was just the number of formal eviction applications. Just in 2018 alone, there was over 20,000 formal eviction applications filed in the city of Toronto. This is about one formal eviction application for every 20 renter households citywide. I don't know if this GIF will work for people. So no, these aren't COVID cases. These are formal eviction applications in the year 2018. And I think this gives you a sense of pace and a little bit around the distribution of eviction filings. We can see so many neighborhoods are impacted and really just quite the rapid pace of filings across the city. It's around 15 seconds long and it goes through 12 months. Just let that play one more time. If we look at the number of formal eviction applications filed across the city of Toronto, we actually see a slight decrease in 2018, down from a high of over 25,000 down to around where we are now, just over 20,000. I go into some hypotheses in the research paper if you're interested to why this may be the case, though I might say that those are hypotheses. Next, we looked at where eviction applications filed, and as I mentioned, there's one formal eviction application for every 20 renter households, but some neighborhoods have 4 times higher eviction filing rates. Some neighborhoods have 1 eviction filing for every 5 renter households, and some buildings in particular have 1 formal eviction application every year for every 2 renter households. So this is a significant number of eviction filings, and it's really inequitably distributed across the city of Toronto's geography. This is a map of just raw numbers of eviction applications filed in 2018, and we can really see that some neighborhoods stand out, in particular in North York, the communities along James Street, all the way from Steeles all the way down to Wilson and 401 and east of there. Parkdale stands out with high numbers, downtown East End, some neighborhoods in Scarborough, as well as West and Mount Dennis. If we control for the number of renters that live in each neighborhood, we can see again, the communities in North York really stand out. West and Mount Dennis stands out more so. Parkdale's still there. You can really see Crescent Town and some neighborhoods in Scarborough. So the next question was, who's most at risk? And ideally, if we had data that was collected for the sake of research, the data that we use here is administrative data. It was never designed for research. It was for record keeping at the Landlord and Tenant Board. So ideally, we'd have sociodemographic information on the individuals that are receiving eviction applications. Unfortunately, this is not possible with the data we currently have. So what we did is we built a regression model that took into account sociodemographics of renter households in each census tract and then correlated them with eviction filing rates. And we did this for the end of 2016 in particular, so the data would be most up to date. And our regression model has the three statistically significant variables, each controlled for that I'll get into a second, as well as age, gender, immigration status. So probably not surprisingly, but still very troubling, is that we see a significant and quite a tight correlation between renter poverty and higher eviction filing rates. When renter poverty is over 50% in a census tract, we see twice as many eviction filings as a neighborhood with 1 in 5 renter households being in poverty. And you can see this really tracks quite closely, tight confidence intervals. The second is a more promising finding. So as subsidized housing increases in census tracts, eviction filing rates significantly decrease. And this, I think, really points to a little bit about what Keisha was talking about, that subsidized housing, co-ops, nonprofit, TCHC, public housing has a moderating impact on eviction filings. And I think this really speaks to nonprofit operators, their prime mission being to house people, as opposed to realizing rents and investment returns. And I think this shows a promising long-term direction on how we can reduce evictions and displacement in our cities. And the third was the most troubling, really, and this was the correlation, controlling for all those other factors, age, gender, immigration status, poverty, subsidized housing. We see this correlation between the number of Black renter households in census tracts and eviction filing rates. And I think this really speaks to Toronto having a racialized eviction problem, perpetuating worse outcomes for Black Torontonians. And it really speaks to the inequities that exist broadly in our society, as well as in rental housing, and now through this research showing that evictions are also a facet of systemic anti-Black racism in the city of Toronto. This is another way of looking at, I love maps personally, so this is another way of looking at the correlation between where Black Torontonian renters live and eviction filing rates. And we can really see the northwest of the city, in particular in communities in North York and West and Mount Dennis, where this correlation is really being driven. And we see high numbers, high rates, and also the communities where more Black renter households live. So everything that I've shown you so far has been quantitative research. So it's just been analyzing statistics from the Landlord Tenant Board, but really to understand evictions leads me to the next step of my research, which is going and talking with experts in the community, tenants that have been facing evictions, service providers, community leaders, to really get a better handle on community knowledge and experience, to leverage this to reduce evictions in our city, to really provide information for tenant organizers and advocacy groups to be able to push for policy change. And this is what I've been focusing on more recently, as well as the policy, which I'll speak to in a second. With this research, we heard from the feds, from the province, from the city, that they see that evictions are an issue, that they see it's a racialized issue and it's an issue of equity. But really the next step, and this can be frustrating and time consuming, is moving policymakers from, okay, we see something needs to be done, to, okay, actually having action to reduce these disparities and these impacts on tenants in our communities. So I know I'm a little bit over, so I'll go through this quick. It's a partnership with the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit at the City of Toronto, partially funded by them. They are great. Highly recommend all the folks that work there. 3 reasons, and there's many, to need to reduce evictions: that it's a racialized problem, and if we want to realize equity in the city, evictions need to be addressed. Evictions spread COVID-19. We know the most common response to when people are evicted is at least temporarily move in with friends and family, sleeping on couches, doubling, tripling up in apartments. And we know that this increases the spread of infectious diseases, and that evictions contribute to homelessness. They're the 3rd highest cause of homelessness when people experiencing homelessness are asked. I know I'm running out of time here for policy. There are 7 policies listed here. I'll have some more research coming out on these, but rent banks with grants, legal aid services are 2 of the most promising. And I hope to maybe get into some of these more in the discussion. Thanks.
Oh, that's excellent, Scott. In fact, I'm like, no, don't end. I mean, I'm just engrossed in it, but all right, to be fair, we'll pick.
Sorry, I would have taken more time. I always try to keep to my time limit, I know.
No, it's good practice. Okay, we're now going to hear from Nemoy Lewis, who is a provost postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Geography and Planning at the University of Toronto. His postdoctoral research explores how space is racialized by examining the co-production of racialization and financialization in Canada's housing markets and the growing affordability problems impacting Black renters. So clearly these topics are all linking and meshing very well already. So take it away, Nemoy.
Okay, so thank you, Jane, for that introduction, and thank you, Keisha and Scott, for your great presentation. So a little bit about why or how I got into this particular research. I got into this particular research stemming from my PhD dissertation, which looked at the US foreclosure crisis in the United States and looking at the way that it impacted the African-American community, both in Chicago, Illinois, and Jacksonville, Florida. And so from that research, I started to notice that a lot of the foreclosed properties were being acquired by financialized landlords, such as private equity funds, hedge funds, and asset management firms. And so these particular firms were essentially profited on the very crisis they helped to create. And so I wanted to learn a little bit more about if this particular activity was taking place in the Canadian context, more specifically in Toronto. Similar to Keisha, I grew up also in Toronto. I grew up along Eglinton Avenue West in the former borough of City of York. And growing up here, I've noticed like a number of changes since the announcement of the LRT. I noticed a lot of the mid-rise level apartments, as you can see in this particular photo, which is a particular building that I grew up not too far from, was being acquired by a number of these different firms. And, you know, I wanted to learn a little bit more about who these firms were. So going forward, what is financialization? So financialization is the increasing dominance of financial actors, markets and practice and measurements and narratives resulting in the structural transformation of economies, firms, including financial institutions, states, and households. So in the context of housing, what I was starting to see was how housing was being valued for its exchange value rather than its use value. So after the 2008 financial crisis, it produced a very interesting environment that sort of attracted the attention of private equity firms and asset management firms and hedge funds, where a lot of people were losing their homes in the United States. And as a result, they had to turn towards rental housing. So one particular entity, Blackstone Group, which is one of the world's largest private equity firm, decided that they were going to acquire large sums of single-family homes across the United States. They eventually became the largest landlord as of 2000, largest private landlord in the United States, owning over 80,000 single-family properties across the United States, with large sums of these properties in communities that were very much hit hard by the foreclosure crisis. And as a result, this captured the attention of a number of private equity firms on this side of the border, but also asset management firms who were particularly interested in the multifamily properties per se here in the Canadian context. And with these multifamily property, in the Canadian context, one of the big issues was that they noticed was that the population was rising in a lot of urban centers where there was a lot of low vacancy rates, but more particularly that they noticed that home ownership was unaffordable to a vast amount of people, a vast amount of households. So as a result, a lot of households in markets such as Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal had to rely on rental housing. So as a result, you had a lot of financialized landlords that were entering this particular space, which allowed which led to record investment volumes in this particular asset class for 4 consecutive years, and eclipsing its previous record of $8.3 billion, which was set in 2018. In 2019, they set a new record of $9.9 billion invested in multifamily. And they were on the verge of also setting another record in 2020, which it was forecast that the investment volume would have surpassed $10 billion if it wasn't for the COVID-19 pandemic. Much of the investment, as you can see, has taken place in the Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal market. And these are data from CBRE, which is a commercial real estate firm, a global commercial real estate firm. And these are investment volume, these are sale transactions over the past 18 months as to June 2019. So one of the biggest fears was that this was going to help to create an oligopolistic market. So what's happening now is that initially when there were deals, you had a number of different players that some were only interested in acquiring these properties and maximizing the profits out of these particular profits by just simply applying annual rental increases. Though some of these entities didn't have enough capital to invest into value-added strategies, which I'll get into a bit later. So what you're seeing now, that as the market is drying up where there's not a lot of deals in these particular markets, you're seeing a lot of the larger players are now acquiring some of the rental portfolios of some of the mid-level entities or the smaller entities who are now cashing out. And as a result, these particular major entities are now able to, where you're going to have just a few set number of landlords in not just in the Toronto market, but across Canada, who are supplying rentals, and which is quite concerning, because that means that they will dominate certain geographical areas, but also they will also have a strong control over price. And so one particular entity is Starlight Investment, which has been spending large sums of money on acquiring different portfolios. Just recently, they spent $2.5 billion in acquiring Northview Apartment REIT. And just last year, at the end of last year, they spent just about $1.73 billion in acquiring Continuum REIT portfolio of about 44 properties, which includes a number of properties in economically disenfranchised communities and racialized communities such as the Parkdale community. They've also done joint ventures in acquiring properties along the new Eglinton LRT line with Blackstone Group, as I mentioned. They've now entered the Canadian market through a joint venture with Starlight, and they've spent about I believe just under $1 billion in acquiring 2 portfolios in both Toronto and the Montreal market. So the property that you saw in the first image was one of the properties they acquired, one of the few properties they acquired along the Eglinton Avenue West. So one of the things that I was quite interested in is who's actually funding these private equity firms. And I came to find out that it was a lot of pension funds and sovereign wealth funds who were supplying a lot of the capital to make to allow these particular entities to acquire these particular properties. So for years, pension funds have been suffering from funding shortfalls as a result of record losses in some of the investments they've made. And as a result, they've turned to alternative investments in real estate, investing in private equities and hedge funds in order to bridge those shortfalls. And as a result, you're having a lot of these particular entities invest. So some of these, as you guys might know, the CPP Investment Board, and also university endowments are also investing in these particular funds, and which I argue that these particular public pension funds and sovereign wealth funds and university endowments are also investing in the displacement of low income families out of their communities. So there's 2 particular investment strategies these companies employ to try to make sure that they meet their profit targets for the quarter or for the year. And that's through squeezing, which is a practice that Martine August and Alan Walks talked about in one particular in a journal article that was published back in 2018. So one of the things that they try to do is they buy a lot of undervalued assets, renovate them, and rapidly increase the rents in these particular properties. They could also reduce the services, repairs, and maintenance in these buildings. So some entities, like I talked about earlier, they might just acquire these properties, use the annual rental increases to increase the rents, to also increase their profits. And they also might engage in reducing the services and repairs in the buildings. But then you have other entities, as I'll talk about in the next slide, who engage in value-added strategies. And so a lot of these, so what this leads to is a decline in living conditions and an increase in housing security. And much of these acquisitions are taking place in racialized communities with high levels of poverty and in communities with a high proportion of single-parent households, primarily mothers. So as I talked about with the value-added strategies, so some companies, particularly Starlight Investment, is one of their core investment strategies is the value-added strategy, which they might make improvements to the exterior of the building, or they might make additions to, such as including a park, or building a park, a pool, a gym, and other facilities to help increase the rents in these particular buildings. They might apply for above guideline increases. So the above guideline increases are when these particular landlords make sort of major improvements or major repairs or replacements, and then transfer those costs to the tenants themselves, which can increase, or as I talk about, exacerbate the affordability and displacement problems in these particular communities. But this particular community I'm speaking about is the Eglinton Avenue West community. And it also could spur gentrification within communities, whereas if you're making a lot of these investments to cater into upper income households, it's making these neighborhoods unaffordable to low to moderate income households. So here's another picture of another property, which is this is the second property that Blackstone and Starlight acquired through their joint venture, which is 2040 Eglinton Avenue West, which is west of Eglinton and Dufferin. And as you can see, the before and after pictures, And so so as you can see with these sort of improvements they've made, they could then transfer the cost to make these improvements to the tenants, and in turn increase in the rents for these particular tenants. And so as you can see from this particular ad, they talk about enjoying condo style living without the fees. So in a sense, it shows you who they're actually marketing these properties to once they acquire and reposition them for the upper income households. And so much of their acquisition that has taken place is in the Eglinton West community, as I talked about, but also, which is, as I said, which is in the former borough of City of York. And much of Starlight's acquisitions have been within this particular borough. And so the next fear is the fear of gentrification. So as you can see, this particular property, which is at 1801 Eglinton Avenue West, which is at the corner of Eglinton and Dufferin, which was just acquired by Kingset Capital. And as you can see with this particular development, it's a 30-story development of 284 units. Though one of the things is that they're only making just less than 16% of these units are being made available. So about 48 units or 47 units that's being made available for rental, but it doesn't state anything in regards to them being affordable rentals. And then with the second project is another proposed development, which is just west of this particular property, which is at Eglinton and Caledonia. And this particular application is for a purpose-built rental, though it doesn't make any notation in terms of the affordability of these rentals. And it's going to be a 7-story, 29-unit development. So addressing the affordability crisis, the one way I suggest is ending vacancy decontrol. By implementing vacancy decontrol, it gives the illusion that rent control doesn't work. But when you have these loopholes, essentially landlords are incentivized to evict tenants at the end of their tenancy in order to meet their profit targets for the quarter or for the year. And next is to amend the rules for above guideline increases. I think right now, especially that we're now, the provincial government has announced that that he's freezing rents for the 2021 year, though he's not prevented landlords from undertaking improvements to the particular properties. So landlords can use the above guideline increase as a way to increase the rents and to make the units unaffordable, and eventually evict the tenants so that they can take advantage of vacancy decontrol. Next, I also think that we should also look to, or the federal government should look to enforce an antitrust laws to prevent an oligopolist rental market where you have just a few players that are providing affordable rentals, primarily in the private market. And as I talked about, Starlight, with their 2 acquisitions, they're poised to become Canada's largest private landlord with nearly 60,000 properties. So that's one of the things that I think an anti-monopoly law will help to protect in addressing affordability concerns. And next is, I think that we should also be looking to other areas or other cities or other countries, in terms of how they've addressing their own affordability crisis. And especially for me, I think that Canada should be looking towards Berlin, which has deployed some very radical strategies, and one being blocking the sale of one particular property in order to regain control of the rental market in Berlin. 2 of the leading political parties have also endorsed a referendum to ban and financialize landlords who own more than 3,000 rental units in the city. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Nemoy. Well, it certainly makes looking at those for rent signs in front of those apartment buildings that have a Starlight kind of green banner on them a lot more interesting. Thank you very much. Okay, well, I think we should just sort of welcome the opportunity for the panelists to pick up on anything in each other's presentations that they want to comment on before we sort of open it up officially. But there are some questions in the chat, and we encourage you to put more there. A few of them have been answered out of point. Maybe we'll bring those up as points of discussion as well. Is there anything that the panelists want to pick up on from the other presentations? Keisha, do you have a sense of kind of overlaps or interesting synergies or Nemoy or?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I didn't discuss in my presentation that I think is, particularly relevant to what both Scott and Nemoy brought up is another way that the co-op housing sector has, expanded historically is the fact that not everything has been a new build. There has also been acquisitions and conversions into housing cooperatives. And so I think towards the end of both Scott and Nemoy's presentations, there's room to think about what the role that conversion to housing cooperatives could potentially play to providing more security of tenure for households who are particularly racialized and also vulnerable because of their socioeconomic status. I think that what's missing again is a really big federal program to support this work. There are whisperings at one point in time that the federal government may be interested as a part of its COVID strategy to acquire hotels and other distressed rental buildings. We have yet to hear follow-up on that, but I think that is certainly a common thread throughout the presentations.
Excellent. Scott or Nemoy, do you have anything that you want to pick up on?
I think just building on Keisha's comment, like I definitely in terms of with the federal government, they did announce that they were going to provide $1 billion to cities to acquire motels, which they said would provide at least maybe 3,000 rental units. I just think that the federal government can do more than $1 billion. For that particular apartment that I talked about, the city of Berlin spent $1 billion to prevent that from being bought by a private equity firm, which is heavily supported by BlackRock, which is an asset management firm. So I think in terms of if we're going to be serious in addressing this crisis, I think that we need to invest more into radical ways of addressing these issues and radical ways of not creating an investment-friendly environment for low to moderate income households to be exploited. So I definitely think that the federal government can do better, but I also think that they need to work collectively, because I think some of the policies that are being put out, they sort of contradict each other, or they negate the issues that they intend on solving.
Yeah, I think I would echo what Keisha and Nemoy were saying there around the opportunity of an acquisition fund. And I think that a lot of people have been trying to make the case for this, and I think making the case really clear, I think will be helpful. And I think it's pretty easy to do. The first is that acquiring existing rental is much cheaper than building new, right? You could get it for about a third of the price, maybe a little bit less. It's significantly faster. You can purchase a building tomorrow and convert it to affordable rental long-term. And I think it helps avoid the financialization that both the presenters were talking about, but Nemoy in particular. That's really the alternative, right? Like I can picture two alternative futures here. We were talking about this a little bit before the panel. One is where we stay on our current path and rental housing becomes increasingly financialized and we get the social and health and well-being impacts of that. Or we start providing a real alternative, which is acquiring these buildings for a significant non-market housing system. And I think that really speaks to Berlin and a lot of European cities that Nemoy was talking about. In Berlin, most people are renters, most people live in social housing. It's a mixed income model that I think we really need to look into more in Toronto. So instead of having a residual sector where it's in Toronto with Keisha was talking about how we haven't been investing in affordable housing or social housing or co-ops. basically over time, this leads to prioritizing groups that are in the highest need, and we end up concentrating need. And this ends up being financially difficult for these housing operators. But if we acted more like Berlin, where we incorporated middle and even upper income renters into these buildings, they'd be more financially viable, cheaper, and we could provide better rents as opposed to extracting them in the form of investments.
There's an interesting question in the chat. It's a little bit of a lateral move, but I find it a particularly a good question to ask in this context, since your university aligned and involved in most cases. It concerns, a divestment campaign. So Chi Tam is asking if a divestment campaign calling on the pensions and institutional investment funds of the universities to require them to get out of predatory rental markets would be effective. These are, pension funds, a lot of them with education or civil service, platforms. So any thoughts on whether a divestment campaign at the university level would be a helpful or possibly effective strategy around this problem of financialization? And
I definitely think I definitely support a divestment campaign. I think that is what I think that would be really useful and like really helpful in cutting off the funds that these private equity and asset management firms receive. But it's just I think that it would definitely work. It's worked in other areas, such as with the pipeline advocacy. It's worked with border carcerality, where CPP, the Canada Pension Fund, there was a number of advocacy groups who pressured the Canada Pension Fund to divest about $10 million investment in border carcerality between the Mexico-U.S. border. So definitely, I think that we should be doing that, just as the way that we are asking universities to divest from fossil fuel production and oil production.
Mm.
I might even riff on that a little bit and think about it perhaps as reinvestment instead of divestment. I think pension funds are often looking for long-term stable returns so that they can pay out their pensions at the end. And rental housing is a good opportunity to do that. And it does not need to be so financialized in a way where it's extractive of tenants and damaging social and health well-being down the line. I think if we want to broaden our kind of option of possibilities here, we could have a social enterprise or nonprofit kind of vehicle here, operator, that could provide long-term rents for reasonable rates and have some units for people that can't afford these reasonable rates. And this is still a profitable venture. Currently, we've got a system that financializes, though with the opportunities that we have, for instance, through really low federal financing, some grant and startup money, I think we could reposition this to encourage investments by, for instance, university endowments and pension funds into kind of a more positive rental investment strategy.
Segueing to another question in the chat, which is about solutions like, zigzag. Again, Chi Yi is asking a question, and this one to Keisha to begin with, which is, you're mentioning of this interesting model of the scattered units inside a large condominium development. And did you say it was 8 units over a few floors? 12 units? I mean, I think there's curiosity about, how that is. Maybe it's working. Okay, it's not a big number inside a very large building, but it's something, and we know it's very hard to get co-ops off the ground and running. So Lord knows there's a whole lot of new builds that goes on in this city, or certainly has until COVID, but, likely to continue. So is this a promising approach? This, so-called a little weird little co-op scattered inside the condo. What's the effect, the impact? What do you know about it? What do you think?
I think the short answer is no. I think that the way that this situation came about was really unique. Like all of the cards had to be on the table to facilitate only those 12 units. There was public land, Section 37, all types of property tax waivers and development charge waivers. This is like a pretty unique circumstance. I think that the closest thing that this may resemble that is currently a policy option on the table would be what apparently looks like inclusionary zoning. So the City of Toronto is currently experimenting with, developing a policy to include affordable housing units, not 30% of income affordable, but according to market rate, and to only do inclusionary zoning in strong market areas like the Naismith example. So primarily in areas where you're getting really tall, very dense condominium buildings, for instance. And so I think that the challenge is that it's not that inclusionary zoning isn't important, but it's that is co-op really the right model for that? If units are scattered across 9 different floors, there are only 12 units. Are you really developing a sense of community amongst those? Are you developing relationships as are defined in the values of what a co-op is? I think, again, the short answer is no, but it doesn't mean we can't think about it more. Yeah. Could it be more successful if all those units were on the same floors? Is that possible? Yeah, it is. I think it's more so thinking more critically about the extent to which as an organization we're embodying our values and we're designing accordingly. So it's not to say, again, that inclusionary zoning cannot be an opportunity for the cooperative housing sector to expand in the city, especially in strong market areas, but that we need to think critically about how those units are able to develop relationships among housing residents.
Keisha, can you tell us what you know about the rationale for scattering them, why they weren't actually grouped on 1 or 2 floors?
I don't think there was actually a rationale. I think that there's more around wanting to not distinguish affordable units from condominium units in buildings. So you don't want people to feel like they're internally segregated in quotations within a building. Right. So I think the common narrative is that sprinkling affordable units throughout a building is the method to make sure that folks feel like they're included in a condominium building, for instance, which may be okay for like a nonprofit housing society whose goals aren't necessarily internally to facilitate cooperative values. Right. For a co-op that matters.
Gotcha. Smart. You're thinking. Yeah. I mean, I know that I've worked on some various projects where the idea of scattering them throughout the building is considered, as you're saying, like a way to integrate, so to speak. But yeah, artscape units, for instance, in a project I sort of many years ago helped try to think through, the artists were given a separate entrance, separate elevators. They were considered, we don't want to have them mixed with the general population. Kind of weird because it's all in the Queen West neighborhood. So
it leads to a question that I have is if we think in this current climate, can we, what is the viability of mixed income communities? Because I struggled with this idea about mixed income communities, especially where I find that a lot of individuals or households are buying homes to be away from certain communities or being in certain communities or being away from a certain class of people. So I struggle with I struggle if they could be actually successful, especially when I think about like the Regent Park community and the way that some of the struggles that that took place in terms of the integration of a lot of the folks that are in social housing, and where you have even in certain properties where some households don't have access to some of the amenities. So I struggle with the idea, like, could we actually, could mixed income communities be successful?
Scott?
Yeah, I would just try to be optimistic, and I would say that they definitely are and can be. And if we look internationally, we can see that that's the case. I think it does come down to what structural incentives or disincentives that we put in place, and what we really demand of our housing system, right? Like in Toronto and in Canada, we rely almost solely on private for-profit development of housing units, right? And, you know, that's what we currently do. That doesn't need to be the case, right? Significant public financing is possible. It's something that we did in the 70s. It's something that's done in other countries. It's not something that's impossible to do. And I think in the absence of that, or at least even ideally in addition to this significant public funding and financing, we could use mechanisms like inclusionary zoning to leverage some affordability out of the private market. But you know, the devil's in the details with programs like that. Some cities' inclusionary zoning policies create a small number of not very affordable units, and some create quite significant amounts of deeply affordable units. So I think there's an opportunity there, but it requires us to change the incentives that are leading to the current housing system that we have today.
If I can jump in real quick just to respond to Nemoy. I think that I agree. I think that context is really important. So like in Toronto, right now, we're arguing that we should be building mixed income communities on public housing sites, which are predominantly racialized. Obviously, folks are low income. I think it's difficult to want to compare ourselves to other models in Europe, for instance, where that was like mixed income was like the basis. You know, now we're dealing with communities who are not used to living in mixed income communities and are often put into a situation where their lives are being decided by, you know, the landlord. In this case, it's TCHC. And I think that sure, public consultation is an important part of getting communities on board, but I think there still remains questions like about the extent to which Regent Park is actually a successful model of, you know, mixed income revitalization. I think as an outsider, you can walk through the community and see that there are non-market and market units, but I know that the public residents who live there know the distinctions between the different colors of the doors that like distinguish the public from the private. It's the nuances that I think are also really important, as opposed to just the big picture policy when talking about what it means to make like an equitable mixed income community.
Can I just, Keisha, there's a very quick follow-up on one of the things that you spoke to, which is again about the scattered sites inside the scattered co-op sites. Chris Robertson is asking if it would help if a CLT owned and governed the scattered site co-ops. Do you think that would make a difference?
So
and what is the CLT?
Yeah, so Naismith is a part of the CLT. The units are a part of a community land trust, which is like a nonprofit organization that typically holds land in perpetuity. And it's usually used to like decommodify, you know, the land that the asset is either held in or built on. I think we have yet to see the extent to which the CLT will be successful in the Naismith example, because the way that CHET envisions this CLT to function is that when other sites like Naismith are developed in condominium buildings with affordable units within them, that all those desperate building units will be contained within a CLT. And so sure, it's a mechanism to hold on to the affordable units, but again, do we really want that building topology as it exists today? And why not just, again, acquire an existing rental building and put that asset in the CLT and move forward?
I want to turn for a moment, if we could, to talk about the effect that COVID-19 has had on the way housing is being even thought through by people generally, how the government's trying to get their head around policies and move to make changes, certainly in temporary sheltering. You know, decisions that would have normally taken 10 years have happened practically overnight by comparison. So there's some pretty interesting things that have come out of COVID. Dare I say some good things in some ways, but of course, a lot of bad. But if you could sort of put on your policy hat for a moment, because there's some questions in the Q&A here about public policies and what's promising, what might be on the horizon. Perhaps we could hear from all of you about what is one positive thing that you could see, a positive outcome or interpretation of the disruption of COVID that could come about and stick with housing policy in now and moving forward. Scott, do you want to start off with that one?
For sure. So I think that there's been a housing crisis simmering in the city of Toronto and cities across Canada for quite some time. It's continued to be a crisis for lower income and often racialized people in our cities. We've seen since the Great Recession, this really spread to this kind of crisis orientation spreading to higher income households, middle and moderate income households. And then with the pandemic recession, like all the different impacts and outputs of the pandemic and the recession combined, I think it really exacerbated these problems and it really made them unignorable, right? And so I think something that we've seen that's positive is around the reframing of housing issues and just like the added motivation to change something about it. We've also seen some programs that were sped up, as Jane, as you mentioned. There's two that really stick out in my mind that weren't even, that were just kind of barely on the radar prior to the pandemic. And then 6 months later, which is it's almost light speed and a lot of policy circles, is first modular housing. Modular housing construction. We've seen in the city of Toronto with a couple sites, modular housing being developed within 4 months. I work with a number of nonprofit housing operators in the city of Toronto. We've been working on a number of projects for 5 years, right? So being able to get something done in 4 months is a big change.
And you know what? I should add that if people listening here and are interested in these topics, when the city does something good, show up, support it, send letters, and most importantly, depute. You are a literate and very savvy group here with a lot of social capital. And I'm telling you that in my business in public engagement, it's one thing to show up for a public meeting and have a comment here and comment there. But this group, and I'm sure a lot of the people listening, deputations, people. The city needs you now. If this is seen to be a solution, boy, oh boy, they're going out on a limb with some things and they need to hear from people that this is an important maneuver.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I was deputing at Planning and Housing Committee on Tuesday.
Yeah, God.
There's also a number of organizations that I've worked with over the years that do training and encouragement around deputation.
Yeah.
In particular, Social Planning Toronto, Commitment to Community, and a number of others. If anyone is interested in any of these, they can send me an email, scott@wellesleyinstitute.com. And I totally agree with you, Jane.
It's as easy as sending an email. Granted, you're going to have to find the email to the clerk, Louis Watkins. I want to depute. You will get time. You're not going to be vetted for your comments. It could be as simple as just reading a one-page letter that you've written that say why you think these things are important. But boy, oh boy, they count for a lot.
And now you can call in and Zoom in. It doesn't even require leaving one's living room, or often a lot of people from work do it, take a 5-minute break.
Those creaky wheels of democracy are actually churning along. All right, that's enough. Nemoy, something that came out of COVID that could almost actually help. Anything?
I think the one thing that I think that the government did, the provincial government did, was through its introduction of Bill 204, which was the Helping Tenant and Small Business Act, which essentially froze rents for the 2021 year. I think that is going to be definitely helpful in providing economically disenfranchised households with much needed help to ease some of the pressure, the financial pressure, especially in this tight rental market. But I think one of the things that, a couple things, I think that the government should extend this rental freeze. I think that if we can recognize housing as a problem in a pandemic, I think that we should also recognize it as a problem separately, as a whole. It needs to be addressed with much stronger policies. But I think, that announcement was welcoming, but I think it needs to be for a longer period. And there also needs to be stipulations that prevent financialized landlords from applying for above guideline increases, because that was one of the exemptions to the rental freeze. And I foresee financialized landlords engaging in non-essential repairs or improvements to the building during during the duration of the freeze, in order to sort of make up from the shortfall of rents increase, the annual rent increase, because I think, you know, we should look, as I said, look to other countries or cities that have instituted rent freezes. Spain, I believe, just introduced a rent freeze for 7 years for financialized landlords, so that preventing them from raising rents, but also preventing them from applying for any sort of increases that sort of loads any capital expenditure costs for major repairs to onto the tenants. So definitely that's one thing that I think that's promising, and I think that we could look to other countries for solutions, and you know, adopting a radical approach to addressing the affordability crisis in Canada, and particularly the Greater Toronto area.
Great, thank you. Keisha, anything that's come out of COVID that could be the policy, the foundation for some progress in policy?
Yeah, I'm thinking of two things. On the one hand, I think that we should be, you know, relatively proud of the new homelessness and supportive housing plan that's come out from the city of Toronto. I think, again, we're thinking about how can we house more people in more permanent housing faster with the supports that they need. I think that this recent investment from the municipal government, there's still money to be contributed from the province and federal government to make this happen. But the fact that we're talking about converting shelter sites into permanent housing for folks who need housing most immediately is incredibly important. And again, in this moment, I would like to shout out Melissa Goldstein's new report for the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust called Fixing the Leaky Bucket. Again, it lays out more strategies for us to think about with respect to how we can provide deeply affordable housing for our residents in Toronto. I think a non-COVID thing that has coincided with COVID that's interesting is that the city of Toronto is finally reconsidering what its definition of affordable housing is in the official plan. I think that's a really big move that we should all be vigilant about. The city will begin consulting on that definition relatively soon to ensure that our definition of affordable housing is more closely tied to people's incomes and not average market rent. There's still a slight relationship that seems to appear in the definition, but we're getting closer to a 30% of income definition for affordable housing. That's really important to hold the city to account to.
Excellent. I haven't, maybe it's a little bit pedestrian in terms of an inquiry, but, a lot of talk about short-term rentals, Airbnb is out there. How this has really impacted the rental market and the supply. From your perspective as people, working in deep policy areas and prevent, evictions and deep affordability, housing forms, do you have anything to say about how Airbnb has had to evolve in response to changes, or even pre-COVID, like regulation? Is it making a difference? Is it contributing in any way positively to affordability and availability?
I'll let whoever wants to go first. I think that is contributing in the current moment, and that's partly and it's helped a lot in terms of the new regulations. Though I think in terms of its success, I think we'll know that when the border reopens, and when travel resumes, and I think if once the border reopens and international travel is able to resume and tourists are able to fly again, come and visit Toronto, I think we will understand then the impacts of it. As of now, I think it's a good impact because of the fact that it's provided by bringing in these policies, and it in concert with the pandemic has sort of helped to improve affordability by providing a lot of supply back onto the market, especially within the downtown core. The struggle that I have, though, is that much of those units weren't ever affordable for low and moderate income households.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's sort of, my issue in terms of, whether we
They're
should.
never affordable to begin with, yeah. But then, I mean, it's just the supply. I mean, where were we at? Like a 1.5% vacancy rate or something before COVID? Like crazy, insane. Anyone else on the short-term rental question? Scott?
I might take a stab at it, and I might say it's a really big question. So what's going on with Airbnb? What kind of impact does it have? I think as Airbnb and other short-term letting platforms, whatever they call themselves, grew, we did start seeing negative impacts in that they compete with long-term affordable rental effectively. And there's also often economic incentives. People can often make more renting on Airbnb, renting out their condo on Airbnb than they can to long-term renters. And that does have an impact, especially in the condo market, on how many of them are rented long-term. I think around the success of the regulations, I'd have to take a look back at the city staff reports. I wonder about non-compliance, it being a kind of a decentralized platform. I would anticipate significant non-compliance, right? That people would continue to rent out these condos year long, not actually their homes, in violation of the bylaws. I really wonder about that. And then I think the last thing that I'll mention is really the demand for these Airbnb units falling off a cliff. The impact of that is still evolving. I think at the beginning of the pandemic, it became clear that either a lot of these units were going to be sold off, right? If you've got 5 of these condos and you're hemorrhaging money on them every month, you either sell them off or you rent them out long term. And we've really seen the latter happening, especially like that a lot of these condos are being rented out. And so you've seen that condo rental supply increase, and likewise the rents on new units kind of decrease. But how that's going to play out long term?
Hard to say. We have a question in the chat, and I think it's probably going to take us to the top of the clock and the end of the session. But if there's something about the bubble, people are, asking in the chat here, Bill Lou, that if you believe there's a housing bubble in Toronto, and if so, if it will burst, and how can we avoid bursting a housing bubble? Now, and it's interesting because I think maybe other people would want to ask, how do we make sure the bubble bursts? As it might actually just be a way that a new generation of people can own a home. So maybe take both of those. Keisha, your hand is up. Yeah. Blow it up.
No, I meant I'm a part of that generation.
Yeah, yes, you are. Yes. I mean, that was the first response I knew people were having to COVID was, oh my God, I might be able to buy a house, right? Legit.
Go for it.
You got it. You got it, Keith. I think it should burst. I think that this market is due for a correction. And though I struggle that will it happen anytime soon, because of the fact that the Bank of Canada has been forced to lower rates, and we're seeing these unprecedented rates that are just so low that it is allowing a lot more people to buy homes. And we sort of saw this in post 2008, where the Harper government sort of instructed the CMHC to buy a lot of these bad mortgages that a lot of Canadian banks issued, and to allow them to improve their liquidity in order to provide more mortgages to prop up the housing market. I sort of kind of see a similar effect happening now, and kind of with the pandemic, because you don't want to raise interest rates, because you raise interest rates, it stops the sort of efforts to stem, the bleeding. So I worry that these low interest rates are just going to further make homeownership unaffordable, especially to those who have secure jobs in the public sector or secure jobs elsewhere, that have not lost their jobs, that have been able to work from home. and continue to make a stable income, it's now forced those individuals to entertain the idea of buying a home because of the fact that the cost of borrowing is so cheap.
Keisha, did you want to say something there?
I was just going to say something very quick. I think going back to what I was speaking to earlier with respect to housing co-ops, on the one hand, we're looking for like large scale federal investment, but like, what about the mom and pop folks who want to create their own co-op and like want to go in and buy a house together and like own something in community? With this bubble, folks still can't do that. Even with 5 friends banding together to raise the capital to buy a house, it's still nearly impossible. And so I think obviously if you own property, you would love your property values to continue to increase. But again, even for the small, like up and coming generation, it's really difficult to envision like ourselves living in the city of Toronto, like the way the market's currently going.
Yeah, I just recently I went into a land sharing house sharing legal arrangement with another couple of women, my lesbian sisters. They're married, I'm single. Well, I'm not single, but I'm not cohabitating. 3 people, a queer family chosen. The bank just like couldn't get it. Like, wait, like, so the banking products aren't there. The legal agreements are, they're not off the rack. I mean, of course, there's lawyers who will do anything for you, but it's just so hard. Anyway, we've done it. We own the Beaver Lodge. It's official, but it's an uphill battle. But as us oldsters, Keisha, maybe we're trying to blaze the trails a little bit. So the generations to come, these housing products, ownership models will hopefully get a lot easier because, wow, it's such a no-brainer thing to share a house with people that you love and you can get along with, and you both like cats, I found. It's working. All right. Last word is over to Scott. You can talk about this or the Airbnb issue or anything else you want to pick up on.
I kind of formulated some comments around the housing bubble question, and another big question, Jane. I really like your big questions. They're difficult to answer in a short period of time, many factors, but some things that first kind of come to mind.
Yep.
As I think, is Toronto in a housing bubble? And I think that kind of depends on your definition of bubble. One classic definition is that the costs are just so detached from the economic fundamentals. And that's certainly the case in Toronto. That's basically inarguable, right? There's another definition around bubbles, and it's, to put it short, you can only really tell they're a bubble after they burst, right? So is that going to happen? I think that's really yet to be seen, and there've been housing bears talking about it for some time, but I think it really does depend on policy. And one of the big ones is kind of what Nemoy was talking about. The Bank of Canada and the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, which is the federal agency, has been spending billions on buying up mortgage-backed securities and bonds to keep liquidity and mortgage lenders lending over this pandemic. And I think this has even contributed, so we saw this detach between cost and fundamentals prior to the pandemic. It's even more the case during the pandemic, right? We're in a recession, unemployment has increased significantly, and yet housing prices are still going up. I think it's a really worrying thing, and it's something that is incentivized either consciously and sometimes subconsciously by government policy.
Cool. All right, panel, you've been fabulous.
Excellent moderating.
Let's just hope, okay, I'm watching for the deputations, all right? I do check in on that level. I am not geeky. I want to see your name on that. And Nemoy, because democracy needs you now. It is a time of disruption. People are really getting it and thinking it out, seeing it and feeling it. People are really, these issues are really more alive now to people than they've been in a long time. So I really do hope with people like yourself, really smart, thoughtful, and generous people and researchers, that this helps move things forward. It's been a pleasure speaking with you and moderating the panel. It's just too bizarre that there's not like hand clapping that you can hear from, like, what do we have? Over 50 participants. Fantastic. Thanks for showing up. Really appreciate it. So I guess we'll just go back to our, cats and pajamas and dinner now, so.
We have some closing remarks.
Okay, great. All right,
Jean-Michel
thanks.
Mention and Patricia Wood. Thank you all so much. I'll turn it over to Jean-Michel now.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Patricia.
Okay, thanks very much. First of all, on behalf of the Robarts Center for Canadian Studies, I want to thank the panelists, Keisha, Nemoy, and Scott for their perspectives, and Jane for leading the discussion. It was a very insightful discussion. It was optimistic in parts and appropriately unsettling in others. I also want to thank the School of Public and International Affairs, especially Joanna and Meg, for organizing a Glendon global debate around this important issue. But what I want to do is take the opportunity to mention the creation of a new research cluster that we have created at the Robarts Center, which fits in well with today's discussion, called CIVIS, on urban governance and citizenship. In collaboration with our university partners, such as the City Institute and the Glendon School of Public and International Affairs, this research cluster will bring into active conversation research from many places and disciplines that examines questions of municipal and urban governance. And this includes formal public institutions such as city councils and bureaucracies and their relationships with other levels of government. But it also includes informal practices of governance within communities, by the police, by global corporations, and so on. Our exploration of urban governance here is deeply spatial, and it critically includes the construction and management of infrastructure, all physical, social, and political institutions that connect and manage mobility, and not just the mobility of people, but the movement of goods as well. So who claims urban space for what purpose, is a critical governance question. And it cuts to the heart of what it means to be an urban citizen, whether that space is the waterfront or the street, and whether it's for the purpose of protest or for the parking of delivery vehicles. So this cluster will support research and events for communication and exchange around these kinds of questions. And we hope that many members of the community will find the work of CIVIS useful and interesting. And towards that end, let me turn to my colleague Jean-Michel Mention for an announcement on that.
Thanks, Patricia. And thank you all for a great event. Before we close today's Glendon Global Debate, Patricia and I would like to invite you to CIVIS' first event, hosted in collaboration with City and the Federation of Metro Tenants Associations. Please join us on the 19th of November for a panel entitled Municipal Governance and the Future of Housing. We will be continuing today's discussion for sure. More specifically, we'll explore creative solutions to address urgent housing needs and to expand the horizon of the debate to what tools exist in the municipal toolbox, including the use of municipal expropriation powers, as proposed by a recent report from the Federation of Metro Tenants Associations called Taking Back Our Housing. Please join us on the 19th if you can, or contact us if you're interested in joining CIVIS, the new research cluster of the Robarts Center. On this note, sincere thanks once again to all for tonight's event. The event has come to a close, so I wish you all a great evening. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye, thank
Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.
Good night.